everyone, and thank you for joining me today to discuss a topic that's incredibly important in the field of cybersecurity, and this is the bias toward authority psychology. My name is Corey Brown, and I'm excited to dive into this topic with you. So starting with this authority bias, we need to define what we mean by a bias toward authority. Now, this term refers to an unconscious or implicit cognitive bias. What that means is that subtle cognitive processes that we are unaware of and are happening outside of our regular thought process and control are what are driving this bias. That means that we have this tendency to defer to authority figures regardless of consideration for whether their decisions are in our own best interest. And this can have pretty serious implications for cybersecurity, especially where the decisions are made by those in authority, and they can carry over and having a significant impact on large companies and their security, their systems, as well as any data stored in those systems. Okay, so where does this term authority bias come from? The earliest thing that we can point to is the Milgram experiment. It was a social psychology experiment where you would have one person who was an actor, one person who was the actual test subject, and another person who was also an actor but was playing the role of a doctor. So you would have these two people meet each other, and they would each be designated a role. One of the actors would be the learner who would get shocked if they got an answer wrong. The other person, this time not an actor, would be the one delivering that shock, as the doctor sat next to them and instructed them to deliver said shock. So these shocks could range all the way up to 450 volts, a fatal shock. And they had pre-recorded yells and screams throughout this, where they were testing to see if this person who was pressing to shock the other would stop, even if being instructed to by this doctor. The results showed that every single participant went up to at least 300 volts despite the screams and protest, and 65% even went up to the maximum of 450 volts. So why do we have this bias? Evolution says that if we possess something in mass, well, then it must be useful in some ways. What most evolutionary psychologists point out is that it's really a shortcut for our brains, and in that way we can save time and energy when making decisions by relying on an authority figure instead. Now, another thing that some have pointed to is that instead you're deferring to a subject matter expert who has the confidence and seems to have a knowledge of their position, and therefore it optimizes learning in our society. So now we have a little bit of a better understanding of what this bias is. Now let's take a look at some examples of how it can play out in the world of cybersecurity. Now, one example is when an IT professional will blindly follow the directives of their superiors without questioning any potential security implications. For instance, a senior exec asks an IT team to install a new software program. Now, that team may not question whether the software is secure or not, and this can lead to serious security breaches due to an insider threat. Another example is the tendency to trust the security recommendations of vendors or consultants. You might think Microsoft, Apple, or some of the large carriers, but without fully vetting those credentials or the effectiveness of their recommendations in relation to this company. Now, just because someone has the title of expert or has this sway behind some of these large companies doesn't always mean that they're always right or that they have the best interest of this organization at heart. Just to really drive home how well used the authority bias is, here's an example of a everyday, advertisement you might see, and you see that maybe they're minorly exploiting bandwagoning, but mostly here it's the authority bias. Similarly, you might see in any advertisement for a new medication, a person in a lab coat, and it's all meant to draw your attention to that authority figure and providing trust in the product. So what are the consequences of this bias towards authority psychology? Well, unfortunately, they can be quite serious. Blindly following the directives of authority figures without considering security implications can lead to major security breaches and data leaks. Additionally, relying too heavily on the recommendations of vendors or consultants can result in wasted time, money, and resources on ineffective or even unnecessary security measures as well. This slide here just lays out several of the real examples of this authority bias being exploited, and it's through email phishing, which appears to be from a legitimate source, authority spoofing, trying to provide credentials that, while they aren't real, attempt to convey a position of authority, maybe IT or management, but also abusing authority to the detriment of those underneath. And in that way, if you have somebody who's an insider threat or has their own personal reasons for pushing something, you can have somebody who's not really critically thinking about what the reasoning might be behind an authority figure. Just to emphasize that email phishing here, BEC scams, otherwise known as business email compromise scams, accounted for over $2 billion in total damages in 2020. And an example of that would be an employee in the finance department receiving a fraudulent email from the CEO with instructions that they needed to transfer large sums of money immediately. This is the buying gift cards and sending them to an unknown source that's pretty commonly seen. Another is social phishing, using some of those authority figures that we mentioned before and using it to just gain some insider knowledge about the inner workings of these companies so that it could be further exploited to then achieve login credentials or otherwise gain access to the system. So in a case that I think really well encapsulates all three of those mentioned above would be the Uber case. This was a case from a while ago, but you had a hacker who called and represented themselves as a member of the IT team, and through using other social phishing calls, he had gained a number of names of people in the company so he could sound trustworthy, and using that, he was able to get login credentials, obviously ones that weren't meant for him, but then be able to sign in to Uber systems and hold their information at ransom. Now, another instance here was once the CSO, the chief security officer, learned of this, he actually chose to withhold this information, pay them a ransom to not release that this information had been compromised, and instead hold on to that. So in this way, he was also abusing that authority when you had people under him who knew of the incident but weren't willing to speak up about it. But there is hope. We can overcome the bias by implementing a few simple strategies, or at least we can hope to kind of limit it a little bit. So first, we need to foster a culture of questioning and critical thinking within our organizations. Any IT professional should feel empowered to question the directives of authority figures, be it the CEO or be it even another IT professional in charge of them, when it comes to security matters. Further, you have to foster this within your corporation, that anyone, in the legal profession, be that your first year or summer associate, needs to be able to critically think and question on if something feels out of the ordinary or if they're being put in a situation where it feels like they should not be put there. Now, second, we need to be diligent about vetting the credentials of vendors and consultants before relying on their recommendations. Don't just take their word for it. Do your own background research, make informed decisions based on the actual data that's driven today. In this way, we can limit a lot of the abuse that occurs from vendors of software targeted towards corporations. Finally, we need to make cybersecurity a real priority within our organizations, and that includes training and resources focused to an understanding of how some of these common attacks look like and why they're occurring. So, would those strategies really be successful? Well, there's lots of information and data coming out that points that education is not actually largely that useful. This is a view shared by Professor Nielsen at UT. And while there are some ways to optimize delivery of that information, such as simplifying it, delivering it in a checklist format, or other methods where it provides employees an actual usable medium as opposed to a hour-long class that most people will be zoned out of. Right now, the data doesn't really show that just education can really make that large of an impact. Now, implementing physical barriers also comes with its own strings attached, and that's that it might prevent access by authorized users or those that the company actually wants to be able to access that information, even if not initially authorized to do so. So this raises the whole debate about accessibility versus security, and I think ultimately this is something that requires a large-scale change in how society understands the technology that they're using, and hopefully it doesn't lead to people feeling like they can't trust anyone, but hopefully it leads to people being more cautious in how they approach being approached on the internet.